Just looking over to see what Lalas does. He's angled himself at the Lithuanian. Two apiece. You wonder whether he'll just try and stay one ahead of Lalas. He is very professional, Brian, from start to finish today was just excellent, really. You've enjoyed yourself, I take it?
Yeah, it was a good contest, and I was coming in here to have some fun, and you know, I knew I had a good shot at winning, so it's just kind of a comfortable, you know, I really wish I would have pulled that 440 deadlift, you know, I was really looking forward to that, but, you know, 430 is not bad, wow, you know, so it was a good day.
Brian, you know, you're now starting to gather up momentum as the favorite for World's Strongest Man. What do you think of that?
You know, I've got a lot of motivation to train for World's Strongest Man. You know, I have not forgotten what happened last year, and I think about
at certain reputation levels. So it took quite a while to work towards that, and it certainly kept you busy in the gold making scene. And he had to throw out his computer chair after he reached it because he had to play it so much. With this new system though, you got your ear-based option to show you firsthand the big events in the game's history, and in later expansions, Blizzard would take full advantage of it with instances such as the killing of Strangholm from Wrath, or the Well of Eternity from Cataclysm. And it of course held away from the Burning Crusade, the battle for Mount Highjaw, the final scene for the Third War, and the end of the Legion's first invasion on Azeroth. Now, I'll go into more detail with unless you want to count the Blackrock's Spire, but at least near the end, it felt like a dungeon anyways because people usually ran it with just 5 and split it up into 2 halves. But anyways, back to Karadan. This was of course the Tower of Medivh, the last guardian, and the person responsible for opening the Dark Portal in the first place, as I mentioned earlier. The hardest fight in the raid by far was the Prince. He had 5 phases and required extreme coordination for your whole raid. Looking back, mechanics-wise, it was probably one of the most complex fights. I mean, 5 phases is quite a lot, even by today's standards. But a bright side was that you got 3 legendaries from this fight. And people say that also weren't nearly as common as they are now. As for the classes you actually leveled, as I mentioned, it launched with 9. So to set the mood here, I'll describe them as how they were pitched and how they performed way back in 2004 when the game launched. Starting off with the spellcasters, first up we have the Mage, who's a pure DPS class. You of course have 3 different talent specializations you could focus on, and that's Fire, Arcane, and Frost. So they were pretty much introduced as the basic spellcaster that most RPGs had. They dealt pretty good damage, and they were highly sought after for their really good crowd control spells such as Sheep, which were much more rare back then. And we also had the Warlock, who was a little more unconventional. This class also used magic, but focused on dark arts and demons. You had the Destruction spec, which powered up your hard-hitting spells like Shadow Bolt, the Affliction spec, which focused on damage over time spells, and the Demonology spec, which made your demons more powerful so they could do the work. They're also a DPS class, but they were also great supporters because they could banish elementals and demons. They also had the Soulstone, which gave you an extra life, and Health Stones to hand out to your friends. And they were the only class that could summon, so they fit that support role very well. And another caster we had was the Priest. They were the main healers for vanilla, but you could also deal some damage depending on your spec. Holy spec was for pure healing, Shadow spec was their dark alternative focusing on damage, and Discipline was kind of a hybrid. They could heal and still do some damage at least. Actually, they were designed to be a melee spec if you can actually believe that. That's why their old Inner Fire spell gave them attack power, which was useless for spellcasting. As I said, this class was one of the best, if not the best for healing, and it's what most people wanted out of a priest for endgame. This brings up something that was very different back in the day. Although each of these classes had 2 specs each, a lot of them were highly imbalanced. The talent tree technically allowed you to put points wherever you want, including an equal amount in each spec. But typically for PvP, there's 1, maybe 2 cookie-cutter points for each class, and if you deviated from that, you usually suffered. For the priest specifically, you could go Shadow spec and do damage, but the downside with them is that they would burn through mana quickly and therefore deal low damage. And at that point, you would just be switched out for a pure DPS class that could do more damage than you, such as a rogue. And similarly, if you tried to deal with discipline and raiding, it's the same sort of thing. Casually, you could pick whatever you wanted to, but if you wanted to be serious with endgame, you pretty much had to follow suit with what the best spec was at the time, and there was a big flaw in terms of game design. It did happen, but it was pretty rare to see feral or balanced druids or retribution paladins in high-end raiding guilds. And speaking of hybrids, let's get into those. The prime example was, and still is probably the druid. They could tank, heal, or deal damage. Feral spec was both a tanking and a DPS tree, balance was for spellcasting DPS, and restoration was the healing tree. quite literally ever since the wrath of the Lich King actually. This is one of the jack-of-all-trades, master of none classes, and it suited players who wanted to do a little bit of everything. But once again, it suffered from the cookie-cutter problem, and most competitive druids ended up being restoration spec, at least for PvE. But in PvP, you did see some specializations designed specifically for play going in the Warsign Gulch battleground. Just like the Warlock, they had their place and they fit it well. Anyways, our next target is the Paladin, which was actually Alliance only. Protection spec is the tanking spec, Holy is the healing spec, and Retribution was for only DPS. Once again, I think that's a jack of all trades, and by being able to bring any free rolls to the table, the Paladin was highly sought after for their blessings. These have been changed 100 different ways since then, but they had these little 5-minute buffs for casters and melee that were really helpful, although annoying to keep up in a 40-man raid since by the time you finish buffing the 40th player, the first player you buffed would gain a refresh. So unless you have multiple Paladins, if you were the only one, you mainly just followed the group and mashed blessings the whole time, only occasionally throwing out some heals in combat if you had the mana. Their counterpart in the Horde exclusive was of course the Shaman. They're a little less versatile because they can't tank, but they made up for it bigly in other ways. They have the healing spec, Restoration, and although not by design, 2 DPS specs, Enhancement and Elemental. Elemental is a spellcasting DPS spec, and what a lot of people don't know, funny enough, similar to the Discipline Priest melee spec, Enhancement was supposed to be for tanking. That's why their Earthshock used to generate threat and one of their totems taunted. And it makes sense if you compare it to the Alliance only Paladin, one spec for tanking, one for healing, and one for DPS. But it turns out, if you only have one threat generation spell, no real taunt, and mail armor, you don't make for a very good tank. So they just ended up being a melee DPS spec that pulls more threats than normal. But something else they had going for them were their totems. This is the answer to the Paladin's blessings. Some of these buff the entire raid with enhancements, both for casters and melee. I know it seems unthinkable now to have such a different raiding experience just depending on what faction you picked, but it was the case back then. It was something that was born before everything was streamlined for social balance, and it has its good sides and bad sides. Obviously a bad side would be that for certain fights, one side would have it way easier than the other, but there is a fun in having such a difference between the two factions. I mean, the two factions cohort with one another so much now, even sharing capital cities. The only barrier that remains is that you can't talk to each other, unless you add them as a battletech friend, of course. In vanilla, there was such a stark contrast between the two factions, and it's something that's become muddled over time, I think. Anyways, let's get back on topic. There was also the Rogue class, the first pure melee DPS class on our list. This is the typical thief character that you see in RPGs. They specialize in agility and stealth to subtly assassinate their enemies in combat, and the 3 specs were just that: subtlety, assassination, and combat. Subtlety focused on improving your stealth and general sneakiness. Assassination had more of a focus on poisons, and combat was a swashbuckling dual sword or mace style. As for the specialty of the rogue in PvE, it wasn't buffing, versatility, nor supporting, it was pure, raw damage. The rogue was one of the most prolific damage dealers in vanilla, and if you had the damage meters back then, it would be filled with yellow bars, and they were one of the best PvP classes out there due to their damage and their stun locking ability. They were the main reason for diminishing returns to be added to the game, in fact. Our next class is a little less subtle, and that's the warrior. The tanking spec is appropriately named protection, and the damage specs are arms in theory. Just like in Legion, arm spec is focused on 2-handed weapons, and pure spec can improve your one-handed dual-wielding abilities, although they sometimes use two-handers as well. Really, what is there to be said about this class? It's pretty much in every game ever created. Hack, slash, and crush, and they were pretty good at it. What they were really good at, though, was tanking, and they were so dominant in that aspect, they would pretty much be the go-to class for tanks. Like I mentioned, feral druids and paladins could tank, but they had holes that the warrior didn't. The paladin had trouble with aggro because he didn't have a taunt, and the druid tanking spec was feral, which is a hybrid of DPS and tanking. The warrior had threat generation, a taunt, and a ton of armor from their ability to wear a plate and equip a shield. They were the best at mighty getting damage, so much so that it later became a problem. To use your abilities, you need rage, and back then to generate rage as a tank, along with attacking, you needed to get hit. Tanks were getting so geared that they weren't taking enough damage to generate enough rage to use their abilities to hold track. In any case, though, they were the standard for tanking back then. And the last class ever released was the Hunter. They of course focused on ranged combat, but mainly through physical damage as opposed to the spellcasting style like the other ranged classes. They used bows, crossbows, guns, and of course the Beast Companion. Like I mentioned earlier, this was probably the easiest class to level because they could have their pet tank while they focus on the damage. Marksman spec improved the Hunter's range damage. Beast Mastery improved the pet's damage and tanking, and Survival spec was originally a melee focus tree, which is actually pretty terrible. This class is unique in the way that you can tame creatures in the wild as your pet, and with hundreds to choose from too. There used to be ones that were way better than others due to their attack speed, or maybe they had a special ability, but that's all been streamlined now. They have the levels separate from your character, and they also used to have a loyalty system to where they became more powerful the more you used them, and you had to feed them to keep them happy, and they used to have a mana bar, so they've changed quite a bit over the years. So those are all of the vanilla classes. They all had their strengths and weaknesses, and they were all very unique and different from each other. Although alts weren't really a big thing back then, you really did want to play all of them. Seeing them in action as fellow game members made you feel envious of all of the roles that only they could fit, and you realized how much of an incomplete puzzle you were if you didn't have certain ones. They all provided such differing playstyles that every time you leveled it felt like a whole new game.